as the title of this talk suggests, I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about my ongoing research in preschool, where I've been looking at pretend play, play narratives, naughtiness, and personhood. And I think people generally expect to find the first three things in anyone's research in preschool, but the last bit is where the wicket gets a little sticky. So before I get into anything else, I want to blast right off into talking about personhood and the status of childhood in the context of late modern schooling. It's sort of my reason for living, and I tend to look at these things through a lens of naughtiness, agency, and fantasy play. Let's advance my slide. Okay. So we know that schools, we know what they are and what they do, and we know that that's changing quite a bit. Some people call this trend radical centralization, and with it, I might call it the commodification of early childhood readiness. My feeling is that part of this is that children are conceptualized not as children, but as containers for future economic productivity and utilitarian rather than expressive selves. Meanwhile, the competing and contradictory discourses of the child as a nostalgic or expressive project also does little to recognize children's actual participation in social life or full personhood. Now, I was lucky enough to be doing my work in rural preschools, and I think that some of those settings are insulated a little bit from what we might call the effects of late modernity. But there's also insulation in preschool because of the very nature of the everyday rebellions happening there amongst highly strategic and agentive small people. The place where I did my work, which I call New Elizabethtown Preschool, children created and thrived in the in-between, or the liminal spaces, where leaky and viscous political and individual practices disrupted attempted regimes of control, order, and productivity. This was particularly visible in children's pretend play. These practices further created opportunities for destructive as well as generative resistant unrulinesses for children and adults alike. While it's important for rural ethnographers to resist the lure of facile romanticization of rural schooling and rural spaces, the generative possibilities afforded in this particular study context were largely borne out by the findings. Okay, so what does all this mean? And what does that have to do with preschool ethnography, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about today? Alan Prout wrote, and I quote, "Whilst the effects of all this gobbledygook on teachers and parents has been widely discussed, its impact on children has remained relatively muted in the public debate," end quote. Similarly, Sharon Stevens admonished us all to attend to the crucial task of developing more powerful understandings of the child in the structures of modernity. This is important to me as I sought ways to emphasize the child as agent in claiming and managing bodies and spaces, drawing on Markstrom and Haldin's call to study the space that is given to children, and on the other hand, how children assume power and make conquests and shape the institutions in which they participate. They are effectively small but mighty. To that end, the study I'm talking about today focused on the everyday experiences of preschool children as understood through a lens of games and the powerful resistant practices in those games. And these are my research questions. So I chose to work with preschoolers not only because of my interest in capturing the immediacy of their first move beyond family circle into a more public world of friends and play, but also in their coming together and play activities, which are prolonged and more common in preschool than in other grades, although I think we could all agree that more free play in all of the grades would be a very good thing. Finally, analyses of the preschoolers' games in my context are situated in the discordant late modern schooling environment in which they, their teachers, and their parents and their school function, and which informs the very structure of the spaces where they're doing the work of childhood.